In this module, we're going to introduce Scrum and talk about some of the most important practices. Scrum actually comes from Japan. There was a paper in HBR in 1986 called the New Product Development Game by Hirotaka Takeuchi and Ikujiro Nonaka, which was based on studies of Japanese companies such as Canon, NEC, and Honda, who had moved away from a very waterfall approach to product design and instead had built empowered, cross-functional, self-organizing teams to do product development in what we would now call a much more agile way. Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland read that paper and took the idea to software development and popularized it in the form of Scrum. And it's called Scrum because the original paper in the new product development game, they used rugby as a metaphor for this collaborative, self-organized way of working. And so that's why Scrum was chosen as the name for this application of new product development approaches to software development. In Scrum, as we've discussed, there are three roles. There's the product owner, the Scrum master, and then the delivery team. There are also 5 events. There's the sprint, which is what Scrum calls an iteration. There's a planning meeting for the iteration called the sprint planning meeting. There's a daily meeting called the daily Scrum. There's a sprint review meeting where we look at all the work that was done in the iteration and review and accept that work, or if it's not done to the satisfaction of the product manager, then that work will carry over into the next iteration. And then there's a retrospective meeting where we reflect on how we can get better at doing our work and come up with ideas for experiments we can try to change the way we work. There's also 3 artifacts: the product backlog, the sprint backlog, which is the list of the work that we're going to do during the iteration, and then there's the increment, which is what we have at the end of the iteration. I'm going to go into some more details on some of these events in the course of this unit. The sprint, the iteration, we'll talk about. The sprint planning meeting is what I'm going to move on to next. I do want to talk about the daily Scrum briefly now because I'm not going to go into it in more detail. The daily Scrum is the meeting that the team has every day, and in that meeting you go around everyone in the team and they answer 3 questions. 1, what did I do yesterday? 2, what will I do today? And 3, any impediments or obstacles. And that third question is particularly important because that's how we as a team work out how we can help each other, and how as managers, delivery managers, product managers, Scrum masters, we can help unblock the team. So the point of calling that a stand-up meeting is that everyone should stand up. And the reason that people are supposed to stand up is so we can get that meeting done quickly. You don't want to stand up in a circle for a long time. So the point of standing up is to get through that, not rushing, but making sure it doesn't turn into an hour-long meeting. Ironically now, that daily meeting is always called the stand-up, and in remote teams, typically everyone's sitting down for the stand-up. So not necessarily a term that has generalized in a particularly helpful way, but that is why it's called the daily stand-up meeting. These rituals are things that I think are useful for any team in any method. Every team I've worked on for the last 15 years has had a daily meeting where we go through what we did yesterday, what we're going to do today, any obstacles, and talk about those obstacles and how to remove them. That's valuable in any context. And I think having a regular planning meeting is really important as well, as is a retrospective. I'm going to talk in a lot more detail about iteration planning meetings because I think they're really important, whatever method you decide to use. They happen at the start of every iteration, and thus they will be on a cadence. If your iterations are weekly, you'll have planning meetings weekly. If your iterations are 4 weeks long, you'll have planning meetings once a month. And you need to put aside enough time to get through that. If you're having them weekly, 1 hour is probably enough. If you're doing them monthly, you probably need 3 hours or half a day in order to get through that work. Before you hold the planning meeting, you need to have user stories written. And those can be written by product managers, they can be written by the team. The important thing is to have them ready and have had the conversations that created the user stories before the planning meeting. You can write stories during the planning meeting, and that's a perfectly acceptable thing to do, but that should not be the way that most of the stories are prepared. You want to get everything you think needs to be ready before the meeting, and then if as you discuss the work you're going to do, you come up with new ideas, you can write new stories, and that's fine. What you do during the planning meeting is discuss how you're going to get that work done and then estimate it. And you'll take things that end up being too big and break them down into smaller chunks. You'll also identify areas of risk and what you're going to do to mitigate these risks. And then at the end of the meeting, you'll look at the available capacity and plan which stories you're actually going to schedule for the next iteration based on the available capacity and the priorities that you've assigned to that work. So just briefly, I want to talk about some of the common risks that you will identify in a planning meeting. First of all, you might identify dependencies on other teams or other systems. And it's an important job for the delivery manager to be able to identify those dependencies as far ahead in advance as possible and work with delivery managers of other teams to try and schedule that work to make sure that teams aren't blocking each other. And that really is program management work. It's identifying program level goals and making sure that teams are scheduling and ordering and synchronizing their work in such a way that everyone can get what they need to do done by the time it's due. Second common risk is that we don't know how we'll do the work. So what we'll do in order to mitigate this risk is do what's sometimes called a technical spike, which is set aside a fixed amount of time to explore various technical approaches to solve the problem. And you might have multiple people working on different possible technical approaches. And at the end of the time you've set aside, you'll get together and discuss what you learned, and then you'll throw away everything you wrote and then actually estimate the work and deliver it for real. The third common risk is that we don't know if the work will achieve the outcome. This is why it's important to adopt an experimental approach and why you need self-organizing autonomous teams. You'll typically build a prototype or an experiment and test it with real users and get feedback to determine if the thing that you're doing is actually going to achieve the outcome. And then if it doesn't, which is quite a likely outcome as we've discussed, you'll then have to work out what you're going to do next based on that. Now let's talk about writing user stories to prepare for your planning meeting. A user story is an artifact which reminds us of a conversation that we had with the key stakeholders on the outcome and what we're proposing to do to achieve that outcome. So for example, if you cast your mind back, we talked about impact mapping and how you could do an impact mapping exercise to start with the outcome and then discuss the various ways to achieve it. That will be the conversation. And then you will select one path through the impact map and write that down as a user story on an index card. And then on the back of that index card, you'll write down, crucially, acceptance criteria, which is how you'll know you're done with that piece of work. So you can then go and do user testing to find out if it actually solved the problem. So to prepare for a planning meeting, you write a bunch of user stories. And as I say, those can be written by the product manager, they can be written by other members of the team, and then you will go through the planning meeting and discuss those user stories and then produce estimates for them. You can record those stories in a spreadsheet, and actually that's a pretty common way to do it, or you might use some kind of work tracking system, of which there are very many, and I'm not going to discuss the various tracking systems because fundamentally they're all doing the same thing, which is allow you to record your work and then track it over time. And then you're going to estimate them. So before we talk about how we do estimation, let's talk about why we estimate. Number one, to identify bits of work that are too big or too risky and break them down into smaller chunks. This is really crucial. Evidence that has been gathered as part of a research program I work on shows that you want stories to be less than a week's worth of work. So when you're estimating, if it looks like that work is going to take more than a week, that means you need to break it into smaller chunks so that they're easier to complete and more predictable and more manageable for your team. Obviously, they should still follow the SMART principles that we discussed in previous units, but you want to make them 1, 2, 3 days work, not really more than that. The second goal of estimation is to develop a shared understanding on the team of how the work will be done, and that's one of the key outcomes of the planning meeting. Number 4, we want to understand if we can actually achieve our goals in the available time. Finally, once we've worked out if we can achieve those goals, we need to report back to our stakeholders so we can set their expectations about what's going to be achieved in the next iteration. So now we know why we estimate, let's talk about how we estimate. What you'll do is you'll pick a user story and you'll discuss it as a team, and then you'll try and estimate in relative terms how much effort is required to complete that story compared to other stories in your planning meeting. There's a number of different units of estimation that you can use, and they range from using jelly beans, like 1 jelly bean, 2 jelly beans, 3 jelly beans, to t-shirt sizes, large, medium and small. Some people use Fibonacci numbers, so 1, 2, 3, 5, 8. And then you can use more sophisticated methods like function points and some of the other things that I talk about on this slide. But crucially, you want those units to be relative. And the reason we're not going to use absolute units is because we don't yet know how long those things will take. Once you've developed a rhythm and your team is really well formed and experienced, then you can measure in days once you've developed that experience. But you don't want to start that way. You want to start by saying, well, this story, that's pretty small, and this story is pretty big, and then you shuffle around stories in between the kind of smallest thing and the biggest thing, and then you kind of group them into small, medium, large, or 1, 2, 3, 5, until you get to the end. And anything that's you think is going to take more than a few days, you're going to break that down into smaller bits. Then, to work out how long it's actually going to take you to do the work, you need to actually deliver. So try it for a few weeks. See how long it takes you to deliver your small, medium and large stories, and then you will have a factor that you can use to take those estimates and turn them into an actual measure of the time elapsed. At the end of the iteration, you'll calculate how much work you did as part of the sprint review meeting. So if you completed 3 stories that were worth 2 jelly beans each, that means that your velocity for the iteration was 6. So this term velocity, that means the work that you got completed in the sprint. And the reason we measure velocity is so we know how much work to plan for the next iteration. So from your second planning meeting onwards, after you've completed estimation, you will look at the velocity from your last iteration, and that will set a limit to the amount of work that you plan for the next iteration. This technique is called yesterday's weather, and it's a capacity planning technique. Our velocity from one iteration determines our capacity for the next iteration so that we don't try and take on too much work. Let's now talk about how we track work over time. A great way to do that is to stick the cards on a wall or a whiteboard, just as is shown in this photo, where you have a column for each status. So here we have in analysis, ready for development, in development, ready for testing, in testing, ready for sign off or acceptance. And you put the cards in those columns. You can actually write things on the cards as they move through the process of being delivered. So you can record using those little stick numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, how many actual days were required to complete the story. That's useful information to have. You can put stickies on it representing who's working on that story at any one time. So it's useful to be able to annotate these cards. Obviously, many people these days are using electronic boards. Most of the tools these days have some kind of way to display these in a kind of story wall-like format and give you the ability to annotate the electronic cards so you can see who's working on them and what the status is and records information like the elapsed time to get the work done. So make sure that you have some kind of way of seeing the state of the work that your team is working on at any one time. And again, evidence shows that having some kind of visual management technique to see the flow of work is helpful and it improves your performance. Another thing that's important to do is actually track work. This is particularly important when you have longer iterations like 2 to 4 weeks to be able to actually see how you're doing. And one common visualization to track work is the cumulative flow diagram, sometimes called a burn-up chart or a turn-down chart or a finger diagram. On this chart, you can see how much work is planned, that's the grey line, and then you can see work that's moved through the various statuses that are represented by the columns on your story wall. So what we can see on this particular chart is that on the 19th of July, there was 55 points worth of work in the backlog. And we can see that 12 points worth of work was dev complete. None of the work had been QA passed yet, and none of the work was yet done. If we move to the end of this, we can see on the 20th of September that there's 80 points worth of work in the backlog. So during those 3 months, more work had been added to the backlog. And at the end of this 3-month period, 60 points worth of work had been dev completed, 55 points had been QA passed, and 55 points had been done. So the nice thing about having a visualization like this is you can predict when you will be done with all of your work. You're just doing a linear regression and working out when that green line is going to meet the grey line at the top, and that will give you your date for when your project will be done. So a useful visualization to have. The most important thing when you're thinking about tracking work is to have a good definition of done. The best definition of done is work that is released into production or in the hands of users. And again, this is very common in modern times. It used to be the case that you would do an iteration and none of the work you were working on in the iteration would actually be released at the end of the iteration. It would just be accepted by the product owner. These days, we don't do that. We're releasing during the iteration, and the review meeting at the end of the iteration is looking at what work was actually released. And that's a great situation to be in. That's what you should really aim for. And that's the norm with modern software delivery practices. So in this module, we've covered a lot of stuff. We've looked at the Scrum framework, where it came from, what the key roles, events, and artifacts are, and we've gone into a bit more detail on what a planning meeting looks like, how we do estimation, and how you run an iteration. Obviously, we can't cover everything. There's a lot more to discuss. You'll find useful resources in the supplemental reading for this unit, and I strongly recommend you go and check that out.